Ever wonder what it's really like to just disappear,
Yeah.
to live life constantly looking over your shoulder?
Yeah.
Well, we're diving deep into that world today, into the world of international fugitives.
Right.
We're looking at a case study from the Philippines.
Okay.
And, wow, you provided some firsthand accounts for this one.
I did.
It's a wild ride.
Absolutely. And I think, this isn't just about like thrilling escapes and, although we'll get to those.
Right.
This deep dive, it gives us a glimpse into like the psychology of someone who is living on the edge.
Yeah.
It shows us the realities of law enforcement across borders and even how international relations kind of ripple effects play into all of this.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our subject, Derek, starts his story with what seems like a shockingly easy escape from the UK. He gets a new passport, even though his old one was confiscated. How is that even possible?
Well, this is something, that it really exposes vulnerabilities, right, that are in these systems. Right. Security measures, they vary wildly from country to country.
Right.
And you can't forget the human element in all of this.
Oh, yeah.
Mistakes, they happen.
Of course, yeah.
But what I find particularly compelling in this case with Derek is how he immediately goes into, the psychological impact of his escape. He talks about, like, the raw anxiety, the palpable relief, like when he's finally in the air and, away.
Yeah.
It's not just an adventure at this point. Yeah. It's a complete roller coaster of emotions that he's going through.
So then he manages to live a relatively normal life for a whole year. What does that tell us about fugitive life or even the effectiveness of international law enforcement?
I think it's a fascinating contradiction, right?
Yeah.
It seems to suggest that blending in, at least for a while, might be easier than we think.
Yeah.
Particularly in a place like the Philippines, which, it's got a very diverse population, tons of islands.
Right, yeah.
But as his story will show, that normalcy doesn't last very long.
Because it all comes crashing down with that tip from the hospital, right?
Exactly. And this is a really good example of how social networks, even seemingly insignificant ones, can unravel a fugitive's in their attempt to hide. You just never know who is watching. You never know who might have a reason to reach out to the authorities. It's a very stark reminder that the past has a way of catching up to you.
Yeah. Okay, so that hospital tip, it really blows his cover. This is where Derek's story takes a turn, right? It goes from a guy laying low to like full-on fugitive mode.
Yeah, it does. That escape from the hospital, it's a turning point in his story, puts him in a much more desperate situation.
He goes to some pretty extreme length to stay ahead of the game at this point.
He does.
Fake IDs, constantly moving around.
Yeah.
The paranoia must have been like through the roof. And his descriptions are so vivid.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget this isn't like some, Hollywood action flick.
Right. It does sound like something ripped right out of, a thriller or something.
Yeah.
But as you said, the stakes were very real for this guy.
Oh, yeah.
And this is where we see the toll that, that this life on the run really starts to have on him. Derek talks about developing PTSD.
Right.
He struggles with addiction.
Yeah.
Even turning to morphine at one point just to cope with this like relentless pressure.
You mentioned PTSD. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
How did that manifest, in his case? Because his offenses, they weren't violent. So to experience that level of trauma, it makes you think about what must have been going on in his head, the guilt, the fear.
Yeah, no, you're right. The psychological impact of this kind of life, it can be really, really significant, even if there's no physical violence involved. In Derek's case, he describes these really vivid nightmares, flashbacks to his escape. He's in a constant state of like hypervigilance, looking over his shoulder. It really shows you how brutal the mind can be. Right. Almost as brutal as any kind of physical, environment.
So, and it sounds like that's not uncommon.
No, it's not. Not at all. Actually, research suggests that a pretty high percentage of fugitives end up experiencing these kinds of things, symptoms like that. And they'll often turn to, drugs or alcohol.
Self-medicating.
Yeah, exactly. To try to numb kind of that psychological pain.
And then on top of all of that, you've got the added layer of danger with the new Filipino president, right?
Yeah.
His stance on drugs at the time.
Right.
Derek mentions that, a few times in his account, how it changed everything for him.
Yeah.
So can you explain that? What does he mean?
Yeah. So this is where, the geopolitical landscape, it really comes into play.
Yeah.
So the new president at the time, he had taken a much harder stance on drug offenses.
Okay.
And this led to all these crackdowns and much harsher punishments. And for someone like Derek, I mean, he's already, dealing with addiction, paranoia.
Right.
This change, it just amplified all the risks for him.
Yeah.
Getting caught, it wasn't just about serving time at this point. It was potentially a death sentence.
So we've got Derek dealing with PTSD,
right,
a growing drug dependency,
yeah,
and this ever-present threat of the Philippines' crackdown on drugs.
Right.
It's a lot.
It is.
Yet he still manages to evade capture for years.
I know.
What finally leads to his decision to surrender?
That is a question that I think intrigues anybody who has followed, a fugitive story.
Right.
Because how do you get to that point? Well, in Derek's case, it was a combination of things.
Okay.
The pressure was just relentless at this point.
Right.
It was getting to him mentally and physically.
Yeah.
And there's this one part in his account, it's really poignant. He talks about the guilt and the fear.
Right.
But it wasn't even just for himself,
Right.
He was worried about his partner and their kids.
Right. He does mention them.
Yeah.
His family.
Yeah.
He talks about how, he's carrying all this guilt because, his actions had consequences.
Of course.
That went way beyond his own life at this point.
Totally. Yeah.
It's one thing to choose that life, on the run.
Right.
It's another thing entirely to put your loved ones through that.
Yeah, the uncertainty, the fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's a lot to put.
So that awareness, that sense of responsibility, that's what finally drives him to reach out to the British Embassy.
Exactly.
And his account of that process, it's a whole other story.
Right.
He talks about this,
it's wild,
almost surreal encounter with a security guard at the embassy. And it turns out this guard, he's connected to the authorities.
Wow.
So, that's the part that I had to read 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
This security guard ends up being instrumental in facilitating Derek's surrender.
I know, right?
That sounds like something out of a movie.
It does.
In your experience, how common is that kind of thing?
Honestly, it's probably more common than you would think.
Really?
When you're dealing with fugitive cases, it's complicated. There's so many different people involved, motivations.
Right.
And not all of them are, straightforward or, good guy, bad guy. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
It's possible this guard, he sees this guy, Derek.
Yeah.
And he's desperate.
Yeah.
Maybe he felt some kind of empathy for him,
right.
This guy needs a way out.
Right.
She needs help.
Right.
Or maybe it was strategic,
Okay.
a way to get Derek to trust him
Okay.
and then, make the surrender easier.
Right.
Less risky.
So we don't know for sure,
We don't know.
but it's interesting.
It is.
Because it shows, even in these crazy high-stakes situations,
Yeah,
there's still that human element there.
there is. There is.
So Derek ends up back in the UK,
He does.
faces justice,
Yep.
and, based on what he says,
Mm-hmm.
he's a changed man.
Right.
The guilt,
Oh, yeah.
the remorse, the impact on his family.
Yeah.
It's clear he still carries the weight of all of his choices.
And he'll carry those for the rest of his life, I'm sure.
This story is just, I don't know.
It's intense.
It's a huge reminder that what we do has very real consequences.
It does.
And not just for us, but for everybody around us.
Yeah, actions have ripple effects.
And sometimes those ripple effects,
Yeah.
they turn into tidal waves,
It really do.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive,
We have.
the mechanics of how to escape,
Right.
the psychology of what it's like to be on the run, the reach of international law enforcement.
Yep.
But for me, I think the biggest takeaway is just the human cost.
It's a good takeaway.
It makes you stop and think,
It does.
Every choice we make,
Yeah.
it has these consequences.
It does, yeah.
Sometimes those consequences are bigger than we could have ever imagined.
And that's life, right?
And that's life.
That's what we're exploring here.
That's it. That's the deep dive.